All right, everybody. I'm happy to be joined again by Sean Casten, who represents Illinois' 6th congressional district. As you all know, he is, unusual congressman. He's a molecular biologist and a CEO of a company who that actually tried to do something about energy costs and climate change. And he is, he's a walk and chew gum at the same time kind of congressman. He can do the politics, but he also does the governing, and that's very tough to do. Congressman, welcome back.
Thanks. So good to be here.
So I have so many things to talk to you about, and I know you have recently made some news about the Supreme Court and actually an energy relief legislation. And I want to talk to you about both of those, but I think we have to start with war. Um, what's your take on where we are in this Middle East war, and what's it going to take uh, to extricate ourselves the right way?
So we are absolutely nowhere good, and I am furious at my colleagues for not uh, uh, voting to object to Trump's ability to declare this war. We've had multiple briefings in classified and non-classified settings, and while I can't talk about what we heard in classified settings, I can absolutely share what we didn't hear. We did not hear anything that would suggest that there was any logical pre-planning for this war. We did not hear anything that suggests that there is any clearly defined measure of success for when this war will be won. We did not hear anything suggesting that after the war is over, there is some plan for anything other than a horribly destabilized Iran at best. And every day this goes on, they dig us deeper and deeper. I mean, what have we spent? $20 billion so far. You now have the White House suggesting that they are so concerned about the impact of this war on the price of oil that they'd like to lift sanctions against Iran. What kind of a moron do you have to be to say we are sanctioning a country that is exporting terrorism, we're going to attack that country, and now we're going to lift the sanctions so that they can make more money?
I can answer
These are
that
morons.
question, Congressman. You have to be the kind of moron that's currently sitting in the White House, and he did the same thing with
It, it,
Russia.
it is just absolutely, there is no plan at all. And meanwhile, I was, it's hard to put this into words. I mean, to assume that invading Iran would not lead to a spike in disruption in global oil markets, the only way that you come to that conclusion is if you have never looked at a map. like anybody who has looked at a map looks at it and says, okay, here's the Straits of Hormuz, here's where Iran sits, here's where oil ships through. None of this should have been surprising, and it's not clear that they had any plan.
Every time he looks at a map, he
issue.
sees a body of water. He calls it the Gulf of America. He doesn't know.
Well, yeah, and frankly, I mean, look, oil is the issue that hits closest to home right now because everybody's seeing it at the gas tank. But at a larger sort of geopolitical level, you have this issue where Iran is not liked by any of the countries in the region. They've been an exporter of terror. They've been, they're not particularly liked, not just by the Israelis, they're not particularly liked by the Saudis or the Emiratis. At the same point, this is a country of 90 million people. The Iranian people are not the Iranian government. And I think the theory that you might at some point get to a government that's more reflective of the will of the Iranian people and the people who showed up at this protest, that's a great theory. We've had that for a long time. The idea that you could achieve that end militarily rather than diplomatically, I mean, maybe I don't read enough history, but I'm hard pressed to remember the last time that the U.S. interfered in a government in the Middle East, and all of a sudden everybody started singing "Kumbaya."
Right, right, and maybe you can overthrow a government, but you can't do it by bombing. That's a troops on the ground misery. slog.
Yeah, and even if you overthrow, I mean, like, I mean, I don't know what Trump's objective was for this war because he said 15 different objectives. It's pretty clear that this war has not led to a rise of a moderate technocratic Western government. So failure on that front. Sometimes he said the purpose of this is to get rid of their nuclear material, but the enriched nuclear material that Iran has is, after the bombing, we didn't destroy the nuclear material. We perhaps, destroyed some of the processing facilities, and how much of that, that's obviously more classified. But enriched nuclear material, you can fit this stuff that they have inside a couple of beer kegs. And these are deep underground in bunkers. You don't remove that stuff to stop proliferation without a lot of boots on the ground.
Right.
And but meanwhile, if you are destabilizing the government that would like to have access to that material for nefarious purposes, if you're destabilizing that government without boots on the ground, all you're really doing is increasing the risk that that material starts spreading out into the region, right? Like who in the Iranian government right now who's looking to curse in favor and get out might not go to one of their neighboring countries and say, hey, for the right price, I can give you some intel and help you get one of these beer kegs out of here. It is just so massively irresponsible on every front.
And they're going to come back to you. I mean, already the big bill gave $150 billion more to the Defense Department. It's now $1 trillion budget, and they want 200 billion more, ostensibly to create a like canal zone around the straits, occupying a good chunk of both sides. That sounds crazy to me.
I mean, look, Congress has the power of the purse, and I think we're shortly going to find ourselves in the position of a parent whose kid just crashed the car because they were out drunk driving, and they're wondering why you didn't give them your allowance yet this week.
Mhm.
Going to be some hard conversations.
I mean, Congress has lots of powers. It has the power of the purse. It has the power to tax. It has the power to declare war. But I think it was Justice Jackson, not our current Justice Jackson, who said, you only have those powers if you're willing to use them.
Well, that's quite right, but it's also, the fact that for Congress to act and use that power, you need to have a majority of the members of Congress who agree to it.
Yep.
For the White House to use their power, particularly in this White House, where no one in the Trump cabinet was selected for their independence of thought or their willingness to stand up to daddy, and so the White House can act right now largely unilaterally. And while there are a lot of members of Congress who are pushing back on this and demanding oversight, including yours truly, if we can't get to 218 votes, then the conclusion is that, well, Congress is not exercising its authority. And that's true because the way that Congress acts is, at least in the House, is by simple majority.
Yep.
But it does create situations down the road that are harder and harder to unpack because all of a sudden, now you create this situation where there's precedent for Congress not, acting to stop the war in Iran, and some future Office of Legal Counsel in the White House will say, well, there was precedent that time, so clearly what we did was legally in the right. So let's push the precedent a little farther. We saw that after the Iraq War. We saw that after Vietnam. And, when I say I'm furious at my colleagues, if we are going to have co-equal branches, we have to jealously defend our authority when the other branches are infringing on it. And if we don't, we're only weakening our own institution.
Yeah, our whole democracy requires it. And do you think there's any chance that this Congress would actually approve yet another big increase to the defense budget?
I think a lot of it, unfortunately, depends on process. Certainly the rhetoric coming out of the Republicans in the House suggests that that they could perhaps get it done, but I don't know. I mean, this morning Lauren Boebert said she wouldn't support an increase in aid package. It only, given where the House is right now, it only takes 2 members to say no.
Yep. Yep.
I think the structural question is, will they try to do this through a legislative vehicle that would be filibusterable in the Senate, and therefore require 60 votes, which would be much harder? Or will they try to do it through a reconciliation process where, under Senate rules, once per year you can pass a budget, and you can't
As they
adjust
did
the
with the
budget
big
without.
beautiful bill. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Johnson has been suggesting that he'd like to do this through a reconciliation package. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
Now, if he can't get that through the House, it's a moot point.
Right.
If I don't, I want to be careful of not, celebrating Lauren Boebert. She has often said that she would definitely do things and then folds once it gets there. But if in fact she holds, and you've got some of the, I don't know who else would be there, maybe a Don Bacon type or a Thomas Massey type or a Mike McCall type who've historically been better on NatSec issues, then maybe you can't get through the House. But we'll see. And frankly, what's going to be hard is that having significantly depleted U.S. munitions, we certainly don't want to be in a position of putting U.S. soldiers in harm's way. But how do you go through and put a package together that makes sure that we still have the ability to protect U.S. troops overseas, but doesn't give the car keys, to people like Pete Hegseth, who have no sense of responsibility or patriotism that you would like them to have in moments like this. And so a lot of that's really going to depend, from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of our party, in how is that package structured, and what kinds of accountability is there on it to make sure that we're prioritizing and protecting the right people.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to the Supreme Court, because on the topic of balance of power in the country, they have meddled in many ways to make it in both undo voting rights and to weaken Congress. And now that maybe they're beginning with whatever this major questions doctrine is, I don't think they know yet, to say maybe we went too far and they're trying to find a way back, but it's really hard to know. You've joined the chorus of people who want to fix the Supreme Court. Talk about that.
So, I come at this from really loving the structure of our government and having three co-equal branches. And sort of like what I was saying before, if the executive branch is going to push back on the legislative branch, we need to push back to defend that, and too often we don't. And in the same fashion, if it was to go the other way, we should protect the other side. And at a headline level, you have a Supreme Court whose the public opinion of the Supreme Court is collapsing. Every Gallup poll has it dropping lower than the next.
By the way, I love it. I don't like the Supreme Court. I'm one of those people. And the idea that they are less popular than the Chicago City Council gives me no end of joy.
Well, but be careful what you celebrate, Edwin, because if we don't trust the judicial system to carry out the rule of law, then you start putting at risk the whole idea that our government depends on the consent of the governed. Right?
I agree with that.
And so, and you see, Justice Roberts concerned about this when he says things. He's at pains to tell people that no one is questioning the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. That's sort of like, a kid on the playground saying, I'm a big tough guy and everybody likes me. You don't say that because you're confident that it's true.
Right.
And I think a big part of the reason for that drop is that people have seen the Supreme Court become increasingly politicized and increasingly ideologues looking to advance an agenda through the courts rather than staying true to the facts. And some of the issues that you mentioned, the idea that the legislative branch writes the laws and the executive branch executes the laws, that's kind of innate to our Constitution. And yet you have this court saying laws that were passed by the legislative branch and enforced by multiple administrations on a very bipartisan basis, like the Voting Rights Act, they're somehow now discovering that that's unconstitutional. Longstanding precedents, like a woman's right to control her own body, are somehow now unconstitutional. Things that we did for a long time, on gun control, are now unconstitutional. The Constitution didn't change. The only thing that changed is the makeup of the court. And if and then of course you layer on top of that the ethics scandals and the weird situation that is Samuel Alito's beach house, and why the heck is his wife celebrating January 6th? And so if the court can't fix themselves, I think we in the legislative branch should do what we need to do to fix it. And the Constitution gives us a lot of power to do that, and history gives us a lot of power to do that. For example, prior to 1925, the Supreme Court did not get to choose what cases they would hear in any given year. That was determined by the lower courts. Yep. And for reasons having to do with sort of judicial efficiency, Congress passed the Judges Act of 1925 that gave the court the ability to set their docket. This court, and indeed every court, has used that power to decide what cases they're going to hear in ways that are consistent with the political views of the justices at any given time. Well, what Congress giveth, Congress could taketh away. So one of the things I've suggested is, why don't we just go and re-amend that act? And I'm not saying Congress should set it, but we could come up with some structure of, some randomly selected panel of senior circuit court judges who are, wise jurists who could decide which of the cases that were appealed, will we grant a writ of certiorari at the Supreme Court for? We could do that. That would massively depoliticize the court. We have the power of the purse, which means that we could, in the next appropriation cycle, if we chose, give the court substantially less money than they ask for, and say that we'll give you the balance subject to the following ethics reforms, which make sure that, Clarence Thomas can't go get a fancy RV every time he's considering his next ruling. That shouldn't be very controversial, but if the court can't implement those ethics rules on their own, we could do that through our power of the purse. We have the power in Article 3 of the Constitution. It specifically says that the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is subject to whatever Congress decides to approve.
Yes.
So we have in our power to substantially limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And I've actually introduced some legislation that would essentially say we're going to create a separate senior appellate court where those judges are selected at random from the 70 or so senior district court judges, so that you couldn't cherry pick rulings knowing that you had someone that was politically attractive to you wearing a robe. Congress could do all that, and none of those things. And I'm happy to have conversations about court expansion and term limits, and that's a longer conversation. But all of those processes, even if you got them done, depend on who you think the president's going to be and who the Senate is going to be for the point of appointing new justices. And so that's a much longer play. These are all things we could do right now. And if you agree with me that the court right now is in desperate need of reform,
yep,
then let's use the power that we have as Congress to make those reforms.
So there are a couple of things about this I really like. One is that I totally agree with you. The court is in desperate need of reform, and we need to move on it. But the other is that what you are asserting throughout all of this is that Congress has power. And we've seen the executive branch assert that it has power and use it, and unilaterally and recklessly. We've seen the court assert that it has power and use it to reshape all of American society, and sometimes allow the executive branch to consolidate power while saying it might be illegal, but saying in their emergency docket, we may be illegal, but we'll tell you later. In the meantime, you can do it. These other two branches are asserting enormous power over America, and the branch closest to the people has, for all kinds of reasons, not asserted its power. And what you are saying, the place you're coming from here is come on, guys, Congress has real power and America needs us to use it. And I love that.
That's absolutely right. I mean, not to get all Spider-Man on you, but with great power comes great responsibility. And if the other two branches are using their power and not using it responsibly, then it is our responsibility to use our power in the way that we have it to correct that. And that's why we have co-equal branches, right?
That's
We're supposed to
exactly
be that
right.
check.
And by the way, those other branches are perfectly happy to check Congress's power if they think you're using it irresponsibly.
Yeah, I mean, look, I joke all the time that if there was ever an election for king, I'd run for that because I think I'd be pretty good at it.
Yeah.
But our Constitution is set up where I can't do that. So I understand why the other branches are jealous for more power.
Yeah.
I just want us to push back when they try.
Yep. Yep. I think that's great. All right. You have I have a couple other sort of general topics, but let me turn to the Energy Bill Relief Act that because like you guys said at the beginning, you're an odd congressman because you actually in the midst of all of this want to get work done. And it turns out that, oh, I don't know, this folly that we talked about at the beginning, this war is driving energy costs up and up and up, and you're trying to do something about that.
Yeah, so we just introduced this week the Energy Bills Relief Act, which I'm really proud. When out of the gate, we've got 120 Democratic co-sponsors on this, which means that more than half of the Democratic caucus has signed on to this. I don't think there's certainly no other bill of this scope that's got that much support. And this has been myself and Congressman Mike Levin, who served on the Climate Committee together, have been working on this for really 3 or 4 years now. And it came out of our work on the Climate Committee when we got all of our climate reports done. About half of those recommendations became the Inflation Reduction Act. But when we did that report, we had some outside analysts who looked at our work and they said, one of the biggest things that's going to pace the success of your recommendations is that we don't build and permit transmission capacity nearly as fast as we should in the United States.
Yep.
And the reason we don't is because we have never really had an energy regulatory system that prioritizes the interests of consumers over producers. And so what we're doing in this bill is to try to fix the way our energy system is regulated so that everybody in the energy system has an incentive to lower the cost for consumers. To give you a little bit of a sense of sort of how that manifests in really weird ways, we build about $20 billion worth of transmission every year in this country. Of that, nearly 95% is built in the name of reliability, and 5% is built to lower costs. So if you're sitting there in one part of the grid that has an abundance of very cheap energy, which means that you are sitting in an area with a lot of hydro, a lot of wind, or a lot of solar, some low-cost supply, which are all the renewable supplies. So this is just as much a climate bill as an energy bill. But if you're sitting in that node, there's no real incentive for your utility to connect your node to a place where the power is much more expensive because they make money when the price is higher, right? It's like any manufacturer. Would you like to sell your stuff for a lot of money or a little money? I'd like to make more money, right?
Yep.
And so the incentives are just wrong. So what we've done in this bill is to say, let's fix the incentives so that utilities can make money when customers save money, which would upend just, essentially 100 years of regulation, but it's the right way to do it. Let's restore the incentives that were in the Inflation Reduction Act that were repealed by my Republican colleagues, so that all Americans have access to the lowest cost energy sources, and whether that means that everybody can get a solar panel or an electric vehicle, or that people have access to home weatherization and insulation, so that your house isn't so drafty in the winter you have to burn so much gas. And then let's debottleneck the big chunks of our transmission system that are way too slow to deploy. We've got 2,000 gigawatts. That's 2 million megawatts, 2 billion kilowatts, if you think in those terms, worth of generation that is almost entirely wind, solar, and batteries. And it can't get on the grid because it presents a competitive threat to people who know that if that comes online, the coal plant can't compete, the gas plant can't compete. So let's get that stuff into the queue and give people the cheaper energy that they want. if we do all that, we will not only massively reduce people's energy bills, but we will also massively reduce U.S. CO2 emissions. This is just an amazing opportunity to have our cake and eat it too, which is why we've gotten so many of our Democratic colleagues signed on, and I would love to pass it this term. I think, the reality of the Trump administration, who wants the energy prices to be higher, is that it's unlikely. But we're really trying to make sure that a minimum to position this where this can be, the Democratic energy bill going into next term. And when that window opens for a more consumer-oriented energy policy, the hope is that this will be the vehicle.
That is spectacular. There's a guy named David Roberts I talk to on the show from time to time.
Oh, David's an old friend.
Yeah, great guy. And he's been talking about these issues with me on the show a lot. And he's been talking about, how do we fix the transmission problem? And he's talking about what you're doing. I mean, it's just fabulous.
Yeah. No, David's great. Fun fact, I used to write years ago for Grist, and
Yep.
David was my editor
Oh,
at
that's
the time.
fun.
So we
That
go
is
way, way
fun.
back. Yeah.
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 So after you found a way to change the incentives so that consumers matter at least as much as producers in this market, could you go deal with healthcare next?
I mean, the interesting thing is that there's actually a lot of similarities, and I'm not a healthcare expert, but energy and healthcare are they're both markets where sometimes and in some parts of the system, we want robust market discipline so that people can't abuse their position, and there's the price competitiveness and all the rest of that. And sometimes in other parts of the system, we want to make sure that people have access to healthcare or energy regardless of what the cost is, because
Yep.
as ethical, moral human beings, we don't want that to go away.
Yep.
And the result is that both systems, both industries, end up sort of half capitalist and half socialist, with
And very
huge
confused.
inefficiencies
Yeah.
where those two different pieces made against each other.
Yep.
And they just end up being sort of schizophrenically regulated. And probably always will be, but if we at least acknowledge that there's a certain, floor level of healthcare energy access we want everybody to have, and that system we're not going to put, goofy incentives into.
Yep.
And then above that, let's make sure that we reward entrepreneurs for being disruptive and all the rest. But there's always going to be opportunity to fix it. And yes, you have my word that after I fix everything that's broken in the energy system, if I'm still alive, I'll move on to healthcare.
Thank you. So look, we've run up against the clock on this conversation, but I do want to talk to you because it's related to energy, but it's also related to our future in many ways, about, AI and what that means, both for energy, but also how Congress is thinking about that. We didn't talk about Jeffrey Epstein, and I know Congress is consumed with that. So there are a whole bunch of other issues out there. So I look forward to our next conversation.
Sounds great. Always a pleasure to be with you, Edwin.
Thank you. And by the way,
Take care.
congratulations on the primary.
Oh, hey, thank you very much for that as well. Good to be going
Yep.
back to work.
Yep. All right.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.